In this video, we're going to be going over how to turn this simple diffuse texture into a complex PBR material shader. To do this, all we need is a simple 2D texture and the Super Texture add-on. Here I'm going to select my texture and then click Apply. In a nutshell, Super Texture basically takes your simple diffuse texture and from that generates additional data including normals, parallax maps, bump maps, roughness, specular, and base color, and using these, it will then apply them using the PBR shader to give you a realistic looking output. And again, you don't need to do anything else and nothing needs to be generated, because here everything is done procedurally. So there's no importing or exporting of files required. As you can see here, you can just apply and remove it, and it will happen almost instantaneously. After this video, you should be able to be more confident in the way you apply super texture and know what fields you need to change when something isn't looking right. So if you haven't got it already, there's a link down in the description below where you can purchase super texture from either the Blender Market or Gumroad. So once you've downloaded the add-on, you'll need to go over to Edit, choose Preferences, and then click Install. Here you'll need to select the location where you downloaded the add-on. Make sure that you install the version that is 280 for Blender 2.8. If you are still using Blender 2.79, then there is also a version for 2.79. Just make sure you download the right option. Here we can see both the available options. In this case, I'm going to select 280 version 1.7 and then click Install Add-on from File. Once you've done this, you can navigate to User to see all of your self-installed add-ons, and from here you should see a super texture option. All you need to do is activate it and then close this, refresh, and you'll be finished. Now in the node editor, when you press N, you should get a super texture tab, and within this you should get the two simple buttons for apply and remove. Okay. So let's get started with the basics of how the super texture node works and what all of the different fields do. The first thing we're going to do is select this and just remove it and turn it back into a normal texture. Then we're going to turn off parallax because this can be a little bit distracting. We're then going to click apply again. And from here we will now edit the settings until we have a nice looking result. So the first thing we're going to focus on here is the height level, contrast, and height blur. So to do this, I'm just going to remove the base color by holding down Control and right click. Then I'm going to change the height level. What this field basically means is at what level should we sample the texture. So if we set this to a really high level, then it only considers parts of the texture that should be really high up above the others. In this case, it's usually the brighter features. So if you have a few bright spots and you set the height level to really high, then only these bright spots will appear. On the contrary, if you set this really low, then all the bright spots will start to disappear and everything kind of evens out. If you go really far down, then it becomes really flat. So here it's important to have enough height in the texture to give enough detail, but at the same time you don't want it to be too high so that you miss out on other details that are present within the texture. So the next field here is the height contrast field. What that lets you do is basically what it says, increase the contrast of the height map. So if we leave that at 0, it looks kind of the same. Say for example, we have a very bland texture that doesn't have a lot of detail in it and is very flat like this, then you can increase the contrast to bring out the details more. So it's fairly basic. Most of the time you want to do a combination of level and contrast, and usually not too much contrast. As you can see, once we turn up the contrast, we lose the gray area between 1 and 0, and we're getting a lot of extremes all the time. We don't get any kind of medium parts, and that's just part of the result of using contrast instead of a combination of both. The next thing here is called height blur, And what this does is basically blur the height texture. If we increase this to a greater number, you can see that the height texture gets blurred out. Now there's two things happening here. The first one is that we lose all of the small features, but the plus side from that is that these bigger features become much larger and take up more area space. This can be particularly helpful when you want to draw out big features from a texture and don't want to focus on all the small little parts. Now the height blur field here is procedural, which means that if you have a relatively low sample rate, the texture may appear very noisy. This means you have to have a decent number of samples before this texture will look okay, or you can use denoising. So this brings us down to the normal size field. The normal size determines at what scale the texture is sampled to generate the correct edges. So at the moment it's set to 0.5, which means we are sampling half of the image size. If we scroll in, you can see that we get these weird artifacts around the edges, and those increase as you decrease the size of the sampling image. This is because the pixels get blurred together and the edges become a lot less distinguished. On the contrary, we can also supersample. So if we set this to 1, this is the default size that the texture is currently, and if we zoom in, you should see that there isn't too many blurring artifacts. The lines are fairly straight. We can also increase this, for example to 2. This will increase the processing power, but at the same time it will increase the resolution of the edge detection sampling. As you can see, this results in a fairly bland image, and the height map doesn't really get extracted very well. But again, it is an option that is available. Usually, for generating big features, like for these bricks to stick out of the texture here, I usually set it to a normal map size of around 0.4 or 0.3. Here you can see that the features stick out a lot more, and instead of having high small details, we have much larger details. You can even set this down almost around 0.2, and then it starts looking not so great. As you can see here, the artifacts are kind of blurring across each other and don't really look fantastic. To counter this, we can increase the height blur, and this will blur across the artifacts and make it look more smooth. In this case, something like 1.5, and this already looks much better. The next few fields here are not related to the normals, so instead we're going to plug the roughness directly into the base color. Here I'm going to hold down Control, right click, and get rid of the other two nodes here. In the black regions we have very high reflectivity. In the white regions we have a lot of scattering. What this means is that those black regions will be a lot more shiny and the white regions will be very rough. If we connect this just into the roughness here, you can see the result with what is happening with the light here. So for the roughness map, there are a few options in this node so that you can change it to your liking. Here I'm just going to plug it into the base color so we can see what we're doing. Then I'm going to go down here and you can see we have a roughness field and a roughness intensity. If we increase the intensity, you can see we get a lot more white, a lot more black, and a lot less gray. This is similar to a contrast operation. In general, you shouldn't need to do this most of the time, but in case you want to get more blacks and whites, or perhaps your texture is too gray, then you can increase the roughness intensity. There is also a general roughness field here, and if you turn this down, you can see that the entire texture becomes black. Essentially, if we have no roughness, then the whole thing should be reflective. The specular here is similar to the roughness, however it is not PBR compatible, as by default a roughness map will usually take over the role. However, if you want to do other renders that are not physically based, there is also an option for specular. And this will help you decide what parts of the textures should be again shiny and what parts of the textures should be dull. The last field here is the texture blur field. Here I'm going to connect the base color and then I'm going to increase the texture blur field. Now if I increase this field here, you can see that the entire simple texture becomes blurred. However, the height map, which we have been generating for the normal and the bump, does not become affected by this. Here the next thing I'm going to do is select this node and click remove. So the next thing I'm going to do is select my texture again. This time I'm going to click use parallax and click apply. Here you can see that we have two extra fields on the bottom, parallax smoothing and parallax offset. In the node editor, I'm going to select the base color, connect it, select the roughness, connect it, and connect the normals. The parallax mapping occurs without the normals and without the roughness, and is basically caused by the base color. So if you just want a parallax result, you actually don't need the roughness or the bump. Parallax will work just by itself through the base color. In this case though, we're going to add the roughness and the normals just because it looks better. So here we have the parallax smoothing and parallax offset fields. The offset determines how far the parallax texture is generated. For example, if we set this to a high value, you can see that it looks like it is much taller and sticking out of the texture much further, but we get a lot more noise and it doesn't really look so great from the side. This is why it's important to balance the parallax offset with the texture information. Here we're going to turn it back down to roughly 2.5. In this case we have a much better result and much fewer artifacts. We still have a couple here though, so I'm going to turn it down until I'm happy with the result. The next thing I'm going to do is modify the parallax smoothing. If we turn this down to 0, you can see that we get a very black and white effect, similar to turning up the contrast for the normal map. Again, this can sometimes be a little bit too extreme, especially for most textures. And in this case, it's better to add a little bit of smoothing, but not too much. If we increase this field to a very high value, you can see that most of the rocks become very smooth. However, the features around them and the shading becomes difficult to see and define. In this case, it is difficult to find proper depth between these two different stones, as they are almost the same color with no shading around them. We also get very weird artifacts that stick out of the texture. In this case, it is usually better to turn down the parallax smoothing so that we have a nice looking result. Again, notice when we turn the parallax smoothing up that each of the rocks gets an outline around it. Here, usually the best result is again around 2.5. This is a good balance of actual offset and a good balance of smoothing to make sure that the shading still looks nice. And so at the end of this video, as you can see here, we have a nice looking PBR material shader. Now there is a couple things I'd like to mention about this add-on before I finish the video. The first one is that it is procedural. So the difference between generators is that they have a lot more access to all of the data in the image, and they can do things like averaging out the image, checking for the maximum and the minimum values, and using all of those different techniques can give you much more realistic and better generated results. So basically the purpose of Supertexture is not to replace the existing files that you have on your system. Usually the height maps, the roughness, the normals that are generated from 3D scans are much more accurate than the ones that you can generate from diffuse images. But the advantage that Supertexture has is that it is completely inside Blender and works really fast. So if you don't have the other textures available, for example roughness or normal, and you just want to see what it will look like if you quickly add this couple of textures on, then this is basically for you. If you found this video helpful, let me know down below as well. But otherwise, hope you have an awesome week, and I'll see you guys in the next one.